Good afternoon. My name is Luisa Blanco, and I'm an assistant professor of economics at Pepperdine University at the School of Public Policy. I would like to welcome all of you, all the Pacific Coast Council members and presenters here today, all those conference participants, and then I also want to welcome the Pepperdine community who is here today. It is a pleasure for me to introduce to you Alvaro Vargas Llosa, our distinguished guest speaker for the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation guest lecture series. Mr. Vargas Llosa is a senior fellow of the Center for Global Prosperity at the Independent Institute. He's a native of Peru and holds a master's from the London School of Economics. He received the Sir Anthony Fisher International Memorial Award for his contribution to the cause of freedom in 2006. He was recently appointed Young Global Leader of 2007 by the World Economic Forum in Davos. Mr. Vargas Llosa published several books related to Latin American issues, such as The Liberty for Latin America, The Guide to the Perfect Latin American Idiot, The Che Guevara Myth, and The Madness of Things Peruvian, among others. More recently, he edited a book titled Lessons from the Poor. Copies of some of these books are available at our bookstore. Mr. Vargas Llosa also publishes in the regular basis in journals such as the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Los Angeles Times also. He has been a commentator for Univision, Radio Nacional de España, among other things. Please join me welcoming Mr. Vargas Llosa today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blanco, for this wonderful introduction. And, thank you, of course, to Pepperdine University and to the School of Public Policy, and to all of you for being here. This is siesta time, so if you want to go to sleep, just be discreet and I won't say anything. So let me, I'm going to talk a little bit about Latin America. I want to talk about how the recent financial crisis in the US affected or did not affect the region. What's happening in Latin America, where I see it going in the next few years, and if there's enough time for it, how U.S. foreign policy might help or hinder that process. So it's a lot of stuff to cover. If I don't get to cover all of it during the talk, I'll be very happy, of course, to answer questions if you have the time afterwards. Just by way of background, as all of you know, we've been through a huge crisis in the United States and around the world in the last 2 or 3 years. There are many different ways of looking at this and interpreting what happened, and we will never be in total agreement as to what happened exactly. The way I look at it, and I want to go into this briefly because I think it has a bearing on what is happening and what will happen in Latin America. The way I look at it is this wonderful country forgot the roots of its greatness. I think that the United States has been living on borrowed money for too long. It lost sight of the fundamentals. It obviously was living beyond its means, and it forgot that savings and prudent investment are really the foundation of growth and prosperity. As all of you know, personal savings rates were dismal, below zero. Government savings rates were even worse, also below zero. The only savings that were had to do with some corporations, some of them in the financial sector, but the overall savings rate in the United States in the last few years was about 13%, which compared to India and China's 35 to 40% is really very, very low. And at the same time, it was maintaining levels of investment of about 20%. So this gap, of course, is pretty much the size of the bubble that built up over the years. Eventually, this bubble was, of course, going to burst, and it was going to have ripple effects all over the world. It did have an effect in Latin America, and the immediate effect was very strong. Latin America took a very, very strong hit in the immediate aftermath. We had in Latin America a significant drop in economic activity. Trade, investment went down by about 30%, 35%. Stock markets went down by 40, 45%. GDP growth, which until then had been very healthy, an average of 5%, dropped very dramatically, and we had negative growth of -2, -3%. So obviously the impact was very strong. However, against all expectations, Latin America recovered very quickly. So much so that this year we're experiencing very healthy growth, pretty much across the board. There are obviously differences from country to country, but generally speaking, the picture is quite rosy. And this is, I think, very significant, mostly for two reasons. One, because it's the first time in history that Latin America is doing well at a time when the most prosperous countries in the world are not doing well. If you look at the development of the evolution of Latin America's economy, you will see a definite link with what was happening in Europe and the United States. We had growth in the 20s, we had growth in the 50s, we had growth at the beginning of the 70s, and usually those were periods in which there was a big impact in Latin America, as elsewhere, of course, coming from what was happening in the United States and Europe. This is the first time in history where Latin America is going through a bonanza, I guess you could call it, with many problems and many shadows, but still, I mean, a period of a clear boom that is somewhat decoupled from what is happening in the United States and Europe. And I think this is really, really significant. Obviously, this means there must be forces at work that were not there before. And they could bode well for the future if we understand what they are and how to manage them and where they're coming from, etc. The other reason why this is important is a more complex one. What is happening is that these forces at work are so powerful that they seem to be blurring the distinction, the difference between the countries that seem to be doing their homework and seem headed in the right direction, and the countries that are not headed in the right direction. Something is pulling the region with such strength and such force that even countries that seem headed in the wrong direction, where the kinds of policies that are responsible for Latin America's underdevelopment continue to take place, are not enough, are not able to prevent the region from moving forward. So that's another very significant issue, and I think it's also a first in Latin American history. Of course, there's a huge problem at the heart of this issue, which is that if countries that are not headed in the right direction seem to be producing some pretty healthy statistics, of course, the struggle to generate change in those countries and to create an environment in which those countries will move in the right direction is going to be a much tougher one. It's going to take a lot more persuasion, and it's probably going to take a lot more time than one would hope. So generally, that's what's happening. The context of Latin America today is a really fascinating one, and there are many ways to describe it, of course. The way I see it, we're going through a cultural confrontation, a cultural struggle. Some people like to think of it as an ideological struggle. Some people look at it as essentially a fight between right and left. But I tend to think it's much deeper than that. I think it's really a cultural struggle. And you've got, if I can simplify matters very much, you've got broadly two sides. And on one side you've got people from the right, but you also have people from the left. And on the other side you've got people from a more traditional left. One side can be characterized as that of the modernizers. These are people who believe in liberal democracy as a political system, in the market economy as an economic, socio-economic system, and in globalization as a kind of framework of relations between Latin America and the rest of the world. And on the other camp, you've got exactly the opposite. You've got forces working against liberal democracy as a political system, forces working against the market economy, and forces working against globalization, at least against strong, intense relations with the West. For them, Latin America does not belong in the West. It is not, as the others think, a part of the Western tradition of Western civilization, and they do everything in their power to decouple Latin America from those currents of opinion and those countries that we tend to see as the leaders of the modern world. On the side of the modernizers, you have a very interesting mix of people. You've got some of the center-right countries led by governments of the center-right, of course, Mexico, Colombia, etc., Chile nowadays. But you also have what I call the vegetarian left. If I can split the left in two camps, the vegetarians and the carnivores. The vegetarians would be those who have moved towards liberal democracy and the market economy, pretty much mirroring what happened in parts of Europe in recent decades. And you've got many countries there. You've got Brazil, you've got Uruguay, you've got even Peru, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, countries that are governed by the left, but it's a center-left that has evolved dramatically from what the left used to look like in Latin America a few years ago. And that group of countries has much more in common with countries that are governed by the center-right than it has with the other side. And the other side, I would characterize as the carnivores. We're talking, of course, about Cuba, Venezuela, perhaps Ecuador, Bolivia, and they never quite know where to place Argentina. It's sort of halfway between the two. So I like to say that Argentina has carnivorous jaws and a vegetarian digestive system. It's kind of a mixed bag, probably leaning towards the carnivores more than the vegetarians. But this is again not, I think, only a political or ideological struggle. It really is a struggle for the soul of Latin America. It has to do with the vision that we have of Latin America. Does it belong in Western civilization? Is it a part of Western civilization? Is it going to go the way of permanent institutions that look like liberal democracy? Is it going to be taking part in the global market economy, or is it not? And I think this struggle is going to be the defining one in the next few years and decades in Latin America. What makes this situation more complicated, as I was saying before, is that we have generally pretty healthy statistics across the board in Latin America today. Just before the financial crisis, we were growing at a rate of about 5% on average, which for Latin America is very healthy. About 40 million people were pulled out of poverty in the first between 2003 and 2008, about 40 million people came out of poverty, which is a very impressive number. We had generally a very interesting phenomenon. For the first time, we had the growth of a middle class that was not linked to the government bureaucracy, unlike what happened in the 60s and 70s. Back then, we also had a period of expansion of the middle class. But that was very closely linked with the growth of government. Government bureaucracy grew tremendously in those years under economic nationalism in Latin America, and that fostered the emergence of a certain middle class. This time, we have a phenomenon that's radically different. It's a middle class that's linked to the market economy. We're talking about small, mid-sized enterprises, many of which are able to sell to bigger companies, and this is generally creating an environment in which people's aspirations for entrepreneurship and other forms of participation in the market economy have avenues available to them, probably for the first time in a very, very long time. So this is what was happening before the crisis, and we had a sort of hiatus during the crisis, but now we're back up again, very fast. And this year, growth is going to be about 5% on average, with countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru doing much better even than that. In the last year, we've had an